Dragonwyck by Anya Seton. Read by Bonnie Hurren.
From childhood's hour I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone. And all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still. From the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm, and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. Alone by Edgar Allan Poe.
Chapter 1. It was on an afternoon in May of 1844 that the letter came from Dragonwyck. One of the Mead boys had seen it lying in the Horseneck post office, and had thoughtfully carried it with him 3 miles up the Stanwich Road to deliver it at the Wells farmhouse. When the letter came, Miranda was, most regrettably, doing not one of the tasks which should have occupied the hour from 2 to 3. She was not in the spring house churning butter, she was not weeding the vegetable patch, nor even keeping more than half an absent-minded eye on Charity, the baby, who had kicked off her blanket and was chewing on a blade of sweet meadow grass, delighted with her freedom. Miranda was curled up against the wall, her pink calico skirts bunched carelessly above her knees in uncharacteristic abandon. A green measuring worm inched himself unchecked across the smooth bodice of her dress. The May breeze, fragrant with apple blossoms and clover from the adjacent pasture, blew her loosened hair into her eyes. She pushed the strand back impatiently with one hand, while the other clutched her book, as Miranda devoured the fascinating pages of The Beautiful Adulteress. So compelling were the beautiful adulteress's adventures that even when Miranda's sunbonnet slipped off and hot sunshine fell through the elm trees onto her skin, she did not pause to replace the bonnet. And yet the transparent whiteness of that skin was the envy of her friends, and part product of many a tedious treatment with buttermilk and cucumber poultices. The Beautiful Adulteress had been lent by Phoebe Mead, and it must be finished by nightfall, so that Phoebe could return it to Deborah Wilson, who had purloined it from her brother's saddlebag. Despite Miranda's 18 years and elegant education at Philander Button's Greenwich Academy, despite avid perusal of this and similar books, she had not the vaguest notion of the horrifying behavior that resulted in one's becoming an adulteress. But that point was immaterial. It was the glorious, palpitating romance that mattered. The melancholy heroes, the languishing heroines, the clanking ghosts, dismal castles and supernatural lights, all entrancingly punctuated at intervals by a tender, a rapturous, but in any case guilty, kiss. Her mother's first call went unheard. It was not until the cry, "Ranny!" changed to a louder and sharper, "Miranda! Where in Tunket are you?" that the girl jumped. She shoved the book between 2 stones in the wall and called hastily, "Coming, Ma!" She brushed bits of grass and drifted apple blossom off her dress and apron, straightened the black mesh net which confined her masses of soft curling hair during the workday, hair that in sunlight shone nearly as golden as the buttercups in the pasture behind her. Then she picked up Charity. "Oh, shame, lambkin, you're wet again," she said reproachfully. The baby at once set up an anguished yell. Even at a year she resented criticism. Miranda laughed and kissed the soft neck. "Never mind, pet. Sister isn't really cross." But she sighed. rapidly checking the chores which must be done before dusk. There was a big batch of the baby's never-ending diapers to be washed and sunned, the butter to be churned, and, worst of all, a fowl to be slaughtered, plucked, and drawn for the Sabbath dinner tomorrow. Miranda loathed this particular task above all others. The sight of blood sickened her, and whereas her brothers and sister found the antics of the staggering decapitated chicken funny, Miranda always felt a little spasm of nausea. Equally unpleasant was the later necessity for plunging one's hand into the chicken's slimy entrails. She usually spent quite 10 minutes scrubbing her slender white fingers afterward, a process which Ephraim, her father, viewed with disapproval when he caught her at it. "Quite the finickin' young lady, aren't we, Ranny?" he growled, frowning at her beneath his bushy eyebrows. "The Lord has mercifully provided us with food, and he has no patience with those who think themselves too fine to prepare it." Ephraim always knew what the Lord was thinking or feeling quite as well as the Reverend Coe did. Miranda assumed that her mother's summons had to do with the chicken, and she walked slowly, shifting the heavy baby from arm to arm and avoiding the barnyard where the destined victim clucked in happy ignorance. As she walked, she noticed absently that the north potato field was deserted, and that therefore her father and 3 brothers must have finished the spraying and moved on ahead of schedule to the great field by Strickland Brook. She also noted that the distant blue of the Sound was unusually clear, and that she could even see the wooded purplish strip of Long Island on the horizon. That meant rain. But otherwise she saw nothing of the beauty of the rolling Connecticut countryside, the flowering meadows, the rustling wine-glass elms and hemlocks, greenish-black against the sky. The farm and the sturdy 6-room farmhouse were simply home, and she had never been farther than 10 miles away from them in her life. As she entered the dark kitchen, she saw with relief that her mother's gaunt, though still handsome face showed neither annoyance at Miranda's tardiness, nor even the habitual pucker of admonition with which she urged her children on to the next inevitable chore. Abigail, who seldom rested from morning till night, was sitting on a reed-bottomed chair and staring at a paper which lay unfolded on the kitchen table. She looked up as her daughter came in. "Here's a strange thing, Ranny. I don't know what to make of it. Can't tell till I've talked with your pa." Miranda followed her mother's puzzled gaze to the paper on the table. "Why, it's a letter, isn't it?" she cried with lively interest. "Not 3 letters a year came to the Wells farm. Can I read it?" "I guess so," said Abigail, "but change the baby first, then knead down the bread dough while I nurse her. Time's wastin'." The girl cast a longing glance at the mysterious letter, but she did as she was told. Abigail flew around the kitchen, cutting bacon with quick, decisive stabs, poking at the embers beneath the oven where the bread would soon be baked. Finally, she unbuttoned her bodice, snatched up the hungry baby, and settled on the low nursing chair. When the dough was set to rise again, Miranda seized the letter. She examined the envelope first. The thick, creamy paper was pleasant and unfamiliar, as was the bold, rather illegible writing, unadorned by the copperplate flourishes or shaded capitals which she had painstakingly learned at the academy. The envelope was addressed to Mistress Abigail Wells, the Stanwich Road, Horseneck, or Greenwich, Connecticut. It was postmarked Hudson, New York, which conveyed nothing to Miranda, who had never heard of the place. But as she put down the envelope and picked up the letter, a thrill of excitement ran through her. It was an intuitive flash of certainty that this bland piece of paper was of importance to her, and, though this intuition was pleasurable, it also contained a fleeting apprehension. She read eagerly. Dragonwyck, May 19th, 1844. My dear cousin Abigail, though we have never met, we are related, as you doubtless know, through our mutual grandmother, Annetje Gansevant. My wife and I, having discussed the matter at some length, have decided to invite one of your daughters into our home for an extended visit. We shall naturally be able to offer her many advantages, which she could not hope to enjoy in her present station. In return, if she pleases, she may occasionally occupy herself with the teaching of our 6-year-old child Katrina, but she will in all ways be treated as befits my kinswoman. I have had inquiries made, and was gratified to find that you and your husband enjoy the honor and respect of your little community. Be so good as to let me know at your earliest convenience which of your daughters you select, and I will make all suitable arrangements for her journey to Dragonwyck. Believe me, madam, your sincere friend and cousin, respectfully yours, Nicholas Van Ryn. Miranda read the letter twice before turning in amazement to her mother. "I don't understand this at all, Ma. Who in the world is Nicholas Van Ryn?" "He is, I believe, a very grand personage," answered Abigail with a half-smile. "He is lord of a large manor up on the Hudson River, somewhere near Albany." "And you're his cousin?" persisted Miranda, still more astonished. "It would seem so," replied Abigail dryly. "I remember my mother telling me of the Van Ryns, though I haven't thought of them in years. Bring me the Patterson Bible." When Miranda had brought the great gilt-edged volume, they examined the records on the fly-leaves between the Old and New Testaments. It was clear enough. Anya Seton of Rensselaer County, New York, had in 1779 married Adrian Van Ryn, Patroon of the Van Ryn Manor, and borne him a son, Cornelius, who must be the father of Nicholas. Then after Adrian Van Ryn's death, Anya had married again, a Connecticut Yankee named Patterson, and thereupon produced a great many children, the eldest of whom had been Abigail's mother. "So, this Nicholas's grandmother is also my great-grandmother," cried Miranda at last. "I had no idea I had such fine relations." She looked down at her tapering hands. She had always privately thought them aristocratic, and it was pleasant to have confirmation. "You haven't a scrap of Van Ryn blood," snorted Abigail, "so you needn't go puffing like a peacock. The connection is only through the Gansevants. Dutch farmers they were, like ourselves. And it's just as well, for the Van Ryns are a wild, strange lot with some kind of skeleton in their closet, for all their money and land and hoity-toity ways." "Truly, Ma?" cried Miranda, her hazel eyes sparkling. "How vastly romantic! Do tell me, please." Abigail shifted the baby to the other arm. "I don't know anything to tell. You and your vastly romantic. You've a head stuffed with nonsense now. But you must know something about this Nicholas who writes the letter. I suppose he's quite an old man. It's a pity his birth date isn't in the Bible." "Oh, he's somewhere in middle life, I guess," said Abigail, "about my age, and I know nothing about him, except that he has great estates and a townhouse in New York, and that 4 years ago, when Van Buren was president, Nicholas often visited at the White House, for I read about it in a newspaper." "Oh, Ma," breathed Miranda, quite overcome. "He must be very grand indeed." She considered these revelations for a moment. Then she burst out, "You haven't said a word about this letter, the invitation." She clasped her hands together in a suddenly childish gesture. "Oh, but wouldn't I love to go!" "And if we should send a daughter, which I think unlikely, why should it be you, miss?" asked Abigail. "Why not Tibby, I'd like to know?" Miranda frowned. Tabitha was 16, and even now at the academy finishing her last term. There was no reason why she should not be chosen, except that Miranda felt that she could not bear it if she were. "Tibby wouldn't want to go," she said slowly. "She's not like me. She doesn't—" Her voice trailed off. Impossible to explain that Tabitha did not hunger after romance, change, adventure as Miranda did. That she actually enjoyed cooking and washing and housekeeping, that she asked for nothing better in life than to settle down on the next farm with young Obadiah Brown and likely have a parcel of babies right off. "But I'm different. I am," thought Miranda passionately. Abigail watched her daughter and read some of these thoughts on the downcast face. Though she would never have admitted it,
her firstborn girl was closest of all to her heart. She secretly gloried in Miranda's delicate, small-boned beauty, in her fastidiousness and dainty ways. She thought her remarkably like one of those exquisite creatures in Godey's Lady's Book, the same graceful height, small nose, and full pouting lips. "So," she said with her normal crispness, "just like that, and with your usual lack of prudent thought, you want to go. You don't consider whether I might be able to spare you, nor do you even seem to think that you might miss us here." Miranda looked up, stricken. She rushed across the room and put her arms around her mother's thin shoulders, resting her cheek on the brown head that was already finely threaded with gray. "Oh, Ma, dear, of course I'd miss you. It's just that it seems so rarely exciting an opportunity." Abigail smiled faintly, and Miranda knew that whether or not she would be allowed to go to Dragonwyck, there would be no real question of Tabitha's going. Her mother straightened, buttoned her bodice, and placed the sleeping baby in the cradle. Then she seized the holy stone and began scouring the oak drainboard. "We'll say no more about the matter now. Hurry up and kill that old white hen. She'll be a mite tough, but the others are laying well, and she'll have to do." She glanced at the Seth Thomas banjo clock that was her great pride. "We're shockingly behind with the work. The men will be in from the fields before supper's near ready." After the evening meal, the May night being warm, the family gathered in the parlor instead of the kitchen for scripture reading and prayer. Ephraim seated himself in the armed Windsor chair beside the cherrywood center table. His open Bible lay before him, and he kept one blunt finger in readiness on the chapter heading. Not a hair of his brown beard quivered. His eyes were stern and nearly motionless, while he waited for each one's respectful attention. They were all there, his wife and 5 older children, seated on stiff chairs in a prim row. Only the baby, gurgling in her cradle by the kitchen fireplace, was exempt. Next to Abigail sat Tom, the oldest of her brood. He was staid and responsible already, despite his scanty 20 years, a duplicate of his father, whom he greatly admired. Seth and Nathaniel, the 2 other boys, aged 14 and 12, cast longing looks out of the window and wondered if the light would hold long enough for a game of run, sheep, run with the Reynolds boys. But they knew better than to wriggle. Many a strapping in the woodshed had taught them that. At the other end of the row, beside Miranda, sat Tabitha. Her hands were folded demurely in her lap. Her plump, freckled face was set to the proper expression of piety. Only Miranda found it nearly impossible to restrain her fidgets. She knew that Ephraim had read the startling letter, and knew also that any discussion of it was impossible until evening worship was concluded. During the 15 of her 18 years that Miranda had taken part in family worship, she had heard the Bible read through 6 times, and though Ephraim read well, rolling the sonorous phrases and giving considered emphasis to every word, she had long ago perfected a method of enjoying her own thoughts, from which she emerged only to say Amen with the others at the end of each chapter. And yet, in spite of herself, she had soaked in a great deal of the poetry and imagery. Sometimes certain phrases mingled with her daydreams, and seemed to touch off delightful little explosions in her mind. It was so tonight, despite, or perhaps because of, her preoccupation with the letter from Dragonwyck. Ephraim read from the 26th chapter of Ezekiel, and her attention was caught by verses which meant nothing to her consciously, though they had power to strike through mist and show her glimpses of a dim, enchanted country. "Then all the princes of the sea shall come down from their thrones. They shall clothe themselves with trembling," said Ephraim's measured voice. It didn't make much sense, thought Miranda, but somehow it was beautiful. Ephraim dropped to a lower, menacing note. "How art thou destroyed, that wast inhabited of seafaring men, the renowned city,
which was strong in the sea, she and her inhabitants, which caused their terror to be on all that haunt it. Fine linen with broidered work from Egypt, blue and purple from the Isles of Elisha, intoned Ephraim, now well into the next chapter, occupied in thy fairs with chief of all spices, and with all precious stones and gold. Miranda felt a wave of sharp yearning. She saw them heaped about her in a marble courtyard, the fine embroidered linens from Egypt, the spices, the precious stones, and the gold. She looked at her parents, at her brothers and sisters' expressionless faces. How could they listen so calmly? Even the Bible admitted that the world was full of mystery and beauty and golden perfumed luxury. How, then, could they be content with sweaty homespun, with the odors of stable and barnyard, and with no gold but potatoes and little spring onions? There was a small scuffle, and Miranda fell to her knees with the rest of the family as her father shut his Bible and began to pray. He always talked to God in much the manner of a senior member of the faculty reporting progress to a respected principal. He touched on the faults of each one of the family, not excepting himself sometimes. He occasionally reported some commendable act, though this honor was usually reserved for Tabitha, and he finished with an intimate and entirely confident request for guidance. Tonight there was an added clause. "This day, O Lord," said Ephraim, "there has come to me a matter of some slight perplexity. Deliver us, we pray, from the pitfalls of rashness or hankering after the flesh-pots." Here he looked briefly at Miranda. "And deliver us from the sins of arrogance and false pride." This time Ephraim's stern gaze rested upon his wife. The situation was therefore clear to Miranda. Her father did not approve of the letter. Disappointment overwhelmed her, nor was it lessened by Ephraim's final words. "However, O God, thy will be done, and whatsoever thou decidest for thy servants, we shall try to do with all our might. Bless and preserve us through the night. Amen." God's will usually seemed to coincide with her father's, and against this partnership there was no hope of appeal. "But I'm not going to give up," thought Miranda hotly. During the hours since she had first seen the letter, its invitation had grown from a delightful possibility into an obsession. She had never in her life had a desire that approached this one in intensity. The fantastic name Dragonwyck enchanted her. She repeated it over and over to herself, and it was as though it pulled her to it and beckoned. Ephraim rose, and her spirits revived a little, for apparently there was at least to be a conference. Usually at the conclusion of evening worship, her father went straight to his black cherry desk, where he entered items in the leather account book. So many bushels of potatoes from the north field, so many heads of cabbage or pecks of peas, wharfage charges, wholesale prices in New York. His cramped figures accounted for every penny while he squinted painfully, his far-sighted eyes blurred on close application. But now he remained standing behind the table and said, "Abby and Ranny, you'll stay in here. I want to speak to you. Tom, water the stock and look to Whiteface. She's freshening. Tibby, is that young spark Obadiah likely to come mooning around again tonight?" Tabitha cast down her eyes, and her round face was suffused with a peony blush. "Oh, Pa," she said in tones of demure horror, "I'm sure I've no notion of his plans. I can't see why they should concern me anyway." A grim twinkle appeared in Ephraim's eyes. "Well, if he should happen to turn up, you may sit on the steps where your mother can keep an eye on you. Though I must say Ob is steady enough, and you, praise be, aren't the flighty kind." "Thank you, Pa," said Tibby, and from between her pale lashes she flung Miranda the tiniest complacent glance. Tabitha was perfectly aware that her piety and domesticity pleased her father.
and that she never gave him a moment's anxiety, as Miranda did. Seth and Nat did not wait to see if their father had directions for them. They sidled through the door and pelted away down the road towards the Reynolds farm. Ephraim reseated himself and indicated with a gesture that his wife and Miranda might do likewise. He pulled the Van Ryn letter from his pocket. "I don't like this letter at all," he said heavily, "and I see no reason even to discuss it, if it wasn't that you two foolish women read it, and Abby acts like it was important." He frowned at his wife. "As far as I can see, there's only one answer." Abigail very seldom disagreed with her husband. Indeed, in most matters her opinions coincided with his. But now her firm mouth compressed. "It is important, Ephraim," she said. "Mr. Van Ryn is my cousin, and seems to me he's making a generous offer. Might be a good thing for Ranny to live for a while in a great house, learn something of the world outside this farm." Miranda threw her mother a grateful look. "I'd like to go, Pa," she said temperately, knowing that emotion of any kind always annoyed him. Ephraim snorted. "Your opinion is of no consequence whatsoever, miss. You're always hankering after new, foolish things. You haven't the sense of a tom-tit. You should be thinking only of helping your mother until you settle down with one of the young sparks hereabouts. You're past 18 and comely enough in a namby-pamby way, I suppose. I don't know what's the matter with you. There's Zach Wilson now. He'd make a fine husband, and he seemed to fancy you. And how did you treat him?" Ephraim suddenly empurpled, banged his hand on the table, and Miranda's heart sank. She knew what was coming. "I've seen you many a time," growled Ephraim, "mincing around, your nose in the air and crying, 'Oh, Zach, don't come so near, you smell of the stable. Oh, Zach, don't play that vulgar dance on your fiddle. Can we not have Love, Sweet Bloom or some refined ballad?' Ha! No wonder he had his fill of your ladyship and is courting the Meads girl." Miranda stirred unhappily. Zach's interest in her and her discouragement of it had been a sore subject for weeks. There was bitterness in being different from the others. Many times she had forced herself to romp through the boisterous square dances and joined in the horseplay and practical jokes which delighted her friends, simply that they might not think her too uppity and queer. "As for this letter," went on Ephraim, returning to the subject, "I think the tone of it offensive. This fine relation of yours, Abby, writes as if he thought himself the King of Spain. What right has he, I'd like to know, to be making inquiries about us, or to think I'd fair leap at the chance to send him one of my girls?" "He doesn't mean it like that, I'm sure," said Abigail quickly. "It's only that the gentry have different ways of putting things." That was a mistake, thought Miranda, watching her father's face blacken. "Oh, indeed," snapped Ephraim. "And since when, ma'am, do ye know all about the ways of the gentry? Come to that, since when do we have gentry in this country, where all are free and equal? A Yankee farmer is as good and maybe a little better than many in this land. We'll say no more about this." He put the letter back into his pocket. "I'll sit down now and answer it." "Oh, Pa, please!" Miranda, galvanized into action, ran around the table and seized her father's arm. "Pa, listen." She spoke breathlessly, her wits sharpened by desperation. "I have a feeling that I meant to go. I mean, during worship tonight, I had a leading. Truly, I did. I think the Lord wants it. At least put it to the test, Pa, please, and see what happens." Ephraim paused. He stared down into his daughter's flushed, pleading face. "Are you speaking the truth, daughter? Search your heart." Miranda nodded earnestly. It crossed Ephraim's mind that the girl, whom he usually thought far too pale and thin for beauty, did have a certain delicate, appealing charm. "Well, you may try the test," he said in a softer voice. He shoved the Bible over to her. Miranda sighed in relief. There was still hope. The Bible test was used only in moments of grave crisis, when its advice was urgently needed, and its decision was always abided by as the manifest guidance of God. She rested her hands on the great volume and sent up a fervent little prayer. If God wanted her to go to Dragonwyck, he would give her a sign. But, just in case, and without more than a fleeting stab of conscience, she intended to do what she could as well. For God helps those who help themselves. Had not Ephraim said so 100 times? Her mind darted over the various Bible stories while Ephraim and Abigail watched her. Of course, Hagar. And the page would fall open because Ephraim so often reread the story of Abraham. She shut her eyes, as was necessary to the test, opened the book, stole a lightning glance through her long lashes, then placed one slender fingertip on a verse. She passed the Bible back to her father, who cleared his throat and read, "And Abraham rose up early in the morning, and took bread and a bottle of water, and gave it unto Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, and the child, and sent her away. And she departed, and wandered into the wilderness of Beersheba." Ephraim stopped, and looked suspiciously at his daughter, who bore the scrutiny calmly. For after all, the Lord had given a sign. She might so easily not have found the right chapter or verse. "It's none too fittin'," said Ephraim grudgingly, "but it does seem to have some bearing. I'll sleep on the matter and pray over it." Miranda's spirits soared. She knew that during the night Abigail would find means to bring Ephraim round to their point of view, so long as the decisive letter of refusal had not actually been written. She felt a sudden urge to get out of the stuffy house into the cool twilight. She avoided the back steps where Tabitha sat with Obadiah, though she heard her sister's high-pitched giggle and little murmurs of coquettish protest. She flung herself headlong on the grass beneath an apple tree and wished on the evening star. Then she lay quiet, her face upturned to the sky, and dreamed of travel and far places, of New York. She pictured it vaguely as a vast city of towers and castles, peopled with elegant silken ladies and dark romantic gentlemen. Amongst the latter, perhaps, there might be one who would press his hand to his heart, though he dared not speak. Perhaps she would drop a handkerchief, as Esmeralda had done in the deserted rose, and when he, bowing, returned it to her, their mingled glances would reveal the message of their souls. It was all very formless and exciting. Chapter 2. Ephraim's stiff letter of acceptance had been promptly answered by a note of instructions about Miranda's journey to Dragonwyck, and at 3 in the morning of Monday, June the 14th, Miranda awoke at a light touch on her shoulder. She opened her eyes to see her mother, candle in hand, standing beside the bed. "It's time, dearie," said Abigail, and the unaccustomed endearment startled the girl into realization of what this day was to mean. She was leaving home, leaving the ordered safety of the familiar, leaving this quiet woman on whose love and sympathy she had always instinctively leaned. Suppose something happened to Ma, thought Miranda in sudden terror. Suppose something happened to any of 'em here at home. She wouldn't even know about it for days. She thrust her bare feet over the edge of the bed and looked up at Abigail. "Perhaps I oughtn't to go," she said slowly. "Something might happen. You'd need me, and, oh, Ma, I'm going to miss you so." This woke up Tabitha, who yawned and said virtuously, "Don't worry about Ma, Ranny. I don't mind doing the extra work when you're gone." The mother knew this to be true. Tibby would not only take over Miranda's work, but do it far better than her sister had. Miranda was full of the most regrettable faults. She was vain and lazy and heedless. She thought far too much about worldly things. She was, as Ephraim constantly pointed out, finicking, while Tabitha was of an upright rectitude that had made it unnecessary to chide her since she was 6. How was it, then, thought Abigail, that, possessing the very model of daughters, she could look upon that plump and dutiful little person unmoved, while the sight of Miranda always gave her a sensation of melting and warmth? She had much ado now not to take that curly golden head and press it to her breast as she used to long ago. Instead, she said, "Nonsense! Course you're going, Ranny," and put the candlestick on the washstand. "No shilly-shallying now, miss. You've got what you wanted, so you might as well enjoy it." There was no answer to this, and Abigail's brisk voice was comforting. Miranda dressed quickly. She put on her church dress of brown merino. It had been impossible to find the money for a new dress, but she had furbished this one as much as possible with a snowy white fichu, and starched her petticoats until they stood out stiffly, and pushed the merino skirt into a creditable imitation of a bell-shaped crinoline. She fastened the fichu with the beautiful hair brooch that was her only piece of jewelry. It had been given her on her 13th birthday while she was convalescing from scarlet fever. It had a real gold rim, enclosing, under glass, a braided rose made from the combined hair of the whole family. Ephraim's grizzled strand twined with Abigail's brown and the children's reddish chestnut to form a pleasing russet shade with a sheen like that of the walnut chair in the parlor. Ephraim had had it made by a jeweler in Stamford, and Miranda was very proud of it. It certainly set off the dress, and nearly matched the elegance of her new bonnet. The Mrs. Lane, milliners in Cos Cob, had made the bonnet after many devout consultations with Godey's, and the one copy they possessed of La Mode à Paris. It was of natural straw trimmed with rose satin ribbons, and in lieu of the ostrich feathers which appeared in the illustration, it was embellished on either side by a large red cotton rose. The egg money which had provided the bonnet could not be stretched enough to include ostrich feathers. Miranda tied the ribbons of this creation beneath her chin, peered into the tiny cracked mirror, then looked to her mother for approval. Abigail thought the girl beautiful. "That bonnet's a mite giddy, but you'll do," she said crisply. "Here's your shawl. Say goodbye to the children and hurry. I hear Tom hitching up." Miranda picked up her traveling basket, which had been made by old Hardy, the last Sinoy Indian, who lived over in the Stanwich woods. It was capacious and sturdy, quite adequate to her scanty wardrobe. Then she leaned over Tabitha, who was half asleep again. "Goodbye, Tibby," she said. Tabitha sat up, and the sisters kissed tenderly, forgetful in this parting moment of all their little squabbles. The younger children, Seth, Nat, and the baby, did not wake up as Miranda kissed them, and her eyes filled. Premonitory pangs of homesickness assailed her. Fortunately, there was little time for emotion during the next half-hour. The market boat for New York would leave Mianus at 5, and they must be at the dock in plenty of time to unload the wagon and get the produce on board. At 4 o'clock, just as the first gray streaks of dawn showed over the distant ridge of Palmer Hill, Miranda clambered up onto the wagon seat beside Ephraim. Tom, who must accompany them to drive the ox team back, settled himself on a bag of potatoes in the rear. Ephraim shouted to the oxen, and they started, with no more drama than that. Miranda waved to the diminishing figure of her mother, barely discernible in the dim light, and thought of 100 things she might have said to her. "Ma, I'll write often. If you need me, I'll come home at once. Don't work too hard, will you, Ma, dear? And take care of yourself, please." She had said none of these things, nor had Abigail said much except, "Behave yourself now. Make yourself useful to Mr. and Mrs. Van Ryn. Say your prayers every night and morning." Miranda swallowed. The familiar countryside blurred.
The wagon rumbled up and down the stony hills on the Catrock Road. The brakes squeaked as they slid down the last steep pitch into the Mianus River valley. Many other farm wagons were clustered on the turnpike below the Dumpling Pond Bridge. Isaac Taylor, in the wagon next theirs, greeted Ephraim cordially, and then peered in astonishment at Miranda. "You folks going somewhere?" he asked. "Mighty early in the day to see a young lady all togged out in finery." Ephraim nodded. "Ranny and I are off to New York with a boat. She's going to visit some of her ma's relations up the Hudson." Isaac whistled. "You don't say. Mind you don't get lost in the big city. Last time I was there in '39, what with all them horse cars and cabs and hacks and the twisting streets and the hawkers wanting to sell you something, I got plumb confused. Was mighty glad to get home again. You never been there, have you, Ephraim?" "I guess we'll manage all right," said Ephraim, "with the Lord's help. Come on, Ranny, get on board. Looks like they're getting ready to sail." She hurried down from the wagon and across the plank to the market boat. There seemed to be no place to sit, so she made her way to the stern through the piled vegetables, dusted off a sack of potatoes, and settled gingerly on that. Tom emerged from the hold and came over to her. "Goodbye, sis," he said, holding out his hand. "Good luck." He hesitated a moment and reddened. "I sure wish I was going too. Like to see the city." "Oh, I wish you were, Tommy," cried Miranda warmly. "Come on, why don't you?" Tom shook his head. "Gotta get back and hoe up the north field. Can't everybody go junketing off at once." "I guess not," answered Miranda. Tom was so responsible. He never forgot a duty or left one undone. "I suppose I am selfish and flighty," she thought unhappily. But nevertheless her spirits began to revive. This was adventure and travel and change. Even Ephraim, she saw, as the boat got under way and slid down the river towards the Sound, was beginning to enjoy himself. His stern face had relaxed. He actually smiled as he chatted with the captain. The tide was with them, and the trip passed quickly. At 8:30, she saw the New York skyline and nearly fell over the rail in her excitement. How very tall the buildings were! Some of them actually had 4 stories. And how many church spires there were! Sunshine glittered off the far-flung jumble of slate and shingled roofs. Confused, distant noises clamored from the shore. The river swarmed suddenly with ships, dories, ketches, market boats, schooners, and an occasional steam packet, all apparently bearing down on the Dora J. Miranda several times braced herself for what seemed an inevitable collision, but nothing happened. They forged steadily ahead, rounding Corlier's Hook to make fast finally at a dock on South Street. Miranda hastily put on her bonnet as Ephraim came aft to her. "Looks like we're here," he said. There was a lack of certainty in his manner, and as they stepped off the boat into a bustle and uproar the like of which Miranda had never imagined, she was both surprised and comforted to know that her father was for once a bit unsure of himself. Isaac Taylor was right. The city was full of slickers. But how did people know right off like that they came from the country? It took them almost an hour to reach the Astor house, because they got lost 3 times. But when they finally trudged up Broadway, each clutching a wicker basket, and saw between Vesey and Berkeley Streets the great pile of granite that was the hotel, Miranda had the answer to her question. It wasn't only the wicker baskets, it was their clothes. No one wore a shallow round beaver like her father's. No one had a fringe of beard under the chin, or long coat-tails, or such wide trousers. And as for the fashionable ladies who were out on Broadway for the morning shopping, their satins and cashmeres, their ruffled and plumed bonnets, no more resembled Miranda's attire than a peacock resembles a wren. Everything about her was wrong. Fashionable ladies did not wear fichus or brown merino. Nobody had darned cotton gloves. And alas,
Though the Misses Lane had done their best, the bonnet was worst of all. It was too deep and too high. Its pink ribbons and red roses were ridiculous. It looked cheap, tawdry, and just what it was, an adapted provincial imitation of a French style of 4 years ago. "Stop sidling along behind me like that," commanded Ephraim sharply. "Hold your head up, and don't act like a scared rabbit. You're entering one of the marts of Mammon, and you'd better hold yourself like a God-fearing girl with nothing on her conscience." "Yes, Pa," and Miranda stiffened her spine, trying hopelessly to look like the haughty young lady in green satin who swept by them into a waiting barouche. They entered the lobby, and she gave a gasp. They seemed to be swimming over a vast sea of red plush carpeting. She had a confused impression of thousands of mirrors, which reflected thousands of gilded gas jets, of marble columns interspersed with hordes of people. No one paid the slightest attention to them, and again they wavered uncertainly, until Ephraim discovered a marble desk at the far end of the lobby. Behind this stood a bored young man drumming his fingers. "Must be the tavern keeper," muttered Ephraim. He lumbered across the carpet with Miranda in his wake. The bored young man looked them up and down, lifted one black eyebrow, and said, "Well, my good man, what can I do for you?" "We're to meet a Mr. Nicholas Van Ryn here," said Ephraim. "Perhaps you can tell—" He stopped in an amazement shared by Miranda. The bored young man was galvanized. He bowed, he smiled, not once, but in a rapid succession of ever more ingratiating smirks. He rang bells, he beckoned to underlings who materialized from behind the pillars. "But of course," he cried, "you are Mr. and Miss Wells. Mr. Van Ryn wrote me. All is in readiness for you. I beg that you will come with me. I will conduct you to your apartment. Mr. Van Ryn will arrive this afternoon. He directed that you were to have anything you wished. Anything," he added with an impressive emphasis, which suggested that if they expressed a preference for the British Crown jewels or an African lion, it would not daunt him. Miranda was dazed. She and Ephraim both made a quick reflexive gesture as two of the bellboys seized the precious baskets. "I'll carry him," cried Ephraim, but they were already out of sight. Miranda and her father found themselves herded up a tremendous staircase, down a brightly lit corridor, and into a large parlor crammed with rosewood furniture. "Your bedchamber to the right," said the clerk to Ephraim, throwing open a door with a flourish, "and the young ladies in there." "You mean we're supposed to use these 3 rooms just for us?" said Ephraim in bewilderment. "Seems like a sinful waste." The clerk looked pained. "Mr. Van Ryn was very anxious that you should be comfortable, sir. I trust that you will be." "I guess so," Ephraim answered. "Much obliged to you, young man." When the door finally closed behind the clerk and the bellboys, Ephraim sat down heavily on the settee. "This Mr. Van Ryn must be very rich and very wasteful. What do people want with all this flummery anyway?" He stared resentfully at the blue plush curtains, the 5 carved chairs, the desk, the center table, the flowered rug, then through the open doors at the 4-posted beds, dressing tables, black walnut armoires, and footstools. "All any sensible body needs is a table, a chair, and a bed." His daughter did not answer. She stood wide-eyed in the middle of the room. Through the open windows came the steady clatter of the traffic. She took the bonnet off and flung it into a chair. She walked to the windows and looked out for a minute while her hand caressed the lush blue curtain fringes. She turned and examined the glass and gilt knobs that held the tie-backs. She leaned over and pressed her finger into the pile of the festooned red and gray carpet. When she straightened, her eyes were dreamy. "I've read about it, but I didn't know people lived like this, really," she said half to herself. "I think it's wonderful." Ephraim made an impatient sound and stood up. "Miranda, you're a very light-minded female. You've always given too much weight to material things. I doubt very much that this excursion into Babylon is good for you. I've a mind to tell Mr. Van Ryn you cannot go."
"Oh, you couldn't do that, Pa," she cried. "You've given your word."
Ephraim's mouth tightened, and he turned away. He had never in his life broken his word, and he would not do so now, but he was uneasy. He had little sympathy with Miranda. Still, she was his daughter, and he was worried about her soul. All the frivolity and worldly tendencies which imperiled it he had tried to eradicate, but with dubious success, he knew very well. It looked now as though she were going into an environment where her worst nature would be fostered by luxury and the general atmosphere of ease and softness that he abhorred. He walked into his room, and shutting the door, fell to his knees in prayer for Miranda. His disquiet was increased later by the girl's behavior. Mr. Van Ryn, it seemed, had no limit to his forethought, or, from Ephraim's viewpoint, foolish extravagance. He had ordered dinner for them. It arrived on trays borne by two black waiters, just as Ephraim and Miranda were preparing to eat the bread and sausages and slices of pie that Abigail had packed in Ephraim's basket. The dinner was colossal, and composed entirely of items that neither of them recognized. Nor were they helped any by the gilded menu which was presented to them by one of the negroes. It was written in gibberish, French, the waiter said in response to Miranda's timid question. She thereupon seized the menu and repeated the outlandish words to herself. "Gigot d'agneau rôti," murmured Miranda, pronouncing every letter carefully. "I wonder what that is." "Tournedos de volaille, compote de fruits glacés." She darted from one dish to another, sampling each. "Oh, but isn't it all tasty? So many different things." Ephraim pushed back his plate and pulled Abigail's sausages from the basket. "Lot of disgusting messes, if you ask me. Good food ruined by a mort of gluey gravies and sauces. Can't tell what you're eating. Don't touch that!" he thundered suddenly as Miranda put her spoon into a mixture of frozen fruits. "It has spirits in it. I can smell it." The fruit had indeed been soaked in rum. Miranda put her spoon down. "But, Pa," she said wistfully, "it looks so good. Couldn't I just try it to see? One bite couldn't really be intoxicating, could it?" "Miranda!" cried Ephraim, shocked. "Would you ever touch liquor in any form just because it looked good?" "No, Pa. I'm sorry. I wasn't thinking, I guess." "Child, child," said Ephraim, not unkindly, "how many sins you commit through your thoughtlessness. You must wrestle with your spirit like Jacob wrestled with the angel. Here, I have something for you." He fished in his basket and brought out a small leather-bound Bible, quite new. "It might be hard sometimes for you to read in the Van Ryn's Bible. I want you to keep this with you in your room. Study it every day. I've marked some passages for you." "Oh, thank you, Pa," she cried, touched. With the exception of the hair brooch, and that had been Abigail's idea, it was the only present she had ever received from her father. Ephraim had written her name on the flyleaf. Miranda Wells, June 1844, from her father. "Read me the 91st Psalm now," ordered Ephraim. "Now?" protested Miranda unhappily. She was in a fever to look out of the window at the fascinating street, to examine her sumptuous bedroom again, to rip some of the trimming off the unfortunate bonnet, and perhaps something could be done about the fichu. It might be turned under, made less conspicuous. Moreover, the early afternoon in an hotel room seemed a strange time and place for Bible reading. But to Ephraim there was never an unsuitable time for the contemplation of Holy Writ, and he felt its need now as a disciplinary measure for Miranda
and as an antidote to the disintegrating influence he felt around him. "Now," he said inflexibly, "I want to hear you read." He sat straighter in his chair, folded his large gnarled hands, and waited. When she came to the 10th verse, he stopped her and repeated it himself in his measured voice. "There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling." I pray that may be so, Miranda, in the new life you're going to. "Oh, pshaw," she thought impatiently. "What evil could possibly befall me in a rich old gentleman's house on the Hudson? Pa makes too much fuss about all this. He's not... She did not know the word she looked for. Sophisticated, perhaps, would have best covered her meaning. Nor did she realize that this was the first time in her life that she had been consciously critical of her father. She finished the psalm and jumped up before Ephraim should order her to go on. "Pa, I must read up a bit before Mr. Van Ryn comes." She fled into her room. By 5 o'clock, Miranda had done what she could to improve her costume. The fichu had been turned under to form a collar. The roses were gone from the bonnet, and she had loosened into ringlets the tight honey-colored braids which had been coiled on either side of her face, giving thanks as she did so that her hair curled naturally. And still Mr. Van Ryn had not arrived. "I think," said Ephraim, giving the curls a disapproving frown, "we better go downstairs and ask that oily jackanapes at the counter if maybe he knows when his high mightiness is coming." The lobby was even fuller than before, and the noise, compounded of chatter and laughter and the constant swish of taffetas, seemed to Miranda to be a roar. The air was loaded with tobacco smoke, the fragrance of rose and verbena water, and hair pomatum. They made their way toward the desk, which was half hidden by a newly arrived family from Philadelphia. Mamma in black satin, a young girl in a paisley shawl and green silk bonnet, and Papa, large and pompous, who was arguing with the clerk about the accommodations. "Excuse me," began Ephraim, craning over the stout back which cut him off from the clerk, when an indefinable murmur ran over the crowded lobby. There was a bustle around the door. Miranda, conscious of the heightened interest, turned with everybody else. A tall man walked through the door, and even in that first glimpse against the light, she received an instant impression of careless dignity and of an almost regal indifference. She wondered vaguely who it might be, when she heard a whisper behind her. "That's Nicholas Van Ryn, you know." And at once the place seemed full of whispers, as one told it to another. She heard the name Van Ryn repeated a dozen times. The family from Philadelphia had ceased arguing, for the clerk, darting out from behind his barricade, had run to greet the new arrival. "That's the Van Ryn Patroon, Nellie," said the Philadelphia mother importantly to her daughter. "He lives on his manor up the Hudson like an English belted earl. I can't think what he's doing in an hotel. They say he's very proud and exclusive." "Oh, Ma," answered Nellie in a subdued squeal, staring with all her might. "Mercy, but isn't he handsome?" And he was, thought Miranda, bewildered by this development, and trying rather frantically to rearrange her ideas. Followed by the smirking clerk, and perfectly indifferent to the gaping around him, he came straight to Miranda and Ephraim with his hand outstretched in cordial greeting. "How do you do, Cousin Miranda and Mr. Wells? Let's go at once to my sitting room, where I can greet you properly, for this is too public a place." And his lean, dark face, which was somber in repose, broke into a charming smile. As Miranda responded to it, sudden excitement possessed her. While they walked down the hall to Nicholas's suite, she stole glances at him through her lashes. He was tall, over 6 feet, and of slender build. His fawn-colored trousers strapped to Wellington boots, his brown coat and traveling cape, were worn with the easy grace of a man who buys the best, is dressed by a valet, and then thinks no more about the matter.
His hair, nearly as black as his boots, was abundant and slightly waving. He wore in his buttonhole a very small red rose, and she was later to learn that the flower in his buttonhole was almost as much a part of him as his long, narrow hands.